We're back on. We were talking about your time at WJXT. There were a few more people that you work with that I know you'd like to bring up.
There was a young man I hired from Louisiana. The way things work, the Warner Brothers salesman came in to see me one day, and he said that there's a woman who lives next door to me. Her daughter just married this pretty smart kid who's working in some small town in Louisiana, 1 year out of college, and you should meet him. So we arranged it, and I met him. His name was Jim Perris. He was 23. He had a wife and a brand new baby, and I hired him to be a promotion producer in Jacksonville. And he drove up in his old car with his wife and his little baby. And I wound up working with Jim for 11 years at 3 different television stations, and then later out here in Los Angeles, which I'll get to later. Great guy, very smart, one of the best hires I ever made. I also had on my staff in Jacksonville Steve Croft, who now hosts 60 Minutes, and he was a great reporter. And we had some really fine people at that station, I think because the Washington Post could draw people to the market that were better than the market as far as market size. So it was a great place to work, and it really helped me learn how to be a GM. Working with people who had to trust me as knowing what I was doing, considering they were all about 20 years older than me. I didn't fire anybody, didn't have to. They were all very good. Generally, when I go into a place, I don't wipe it out. I don't even try to change anybody for the first 6 months. I want to assess who's there and see if they're good enough to continue, because I've seen bosses, and it happened to me once, they just come in and wipe out everyone their predecessor hired with no reason to do it except they want their own people. That's dumb. That's dumb. There's sometimes very good people right under your nose. So anyway, I went into Jacksonville, and I don't recall changing anybody. I had a couple of promotion producers in Jacksonville. Jim was one of them. The other one was named Lynn Lucier, who produced promos and wound up coming out here and starting her own business and doing multiple promos for ABC Network. And she's well known in the Los Angeles area. And those were my 2 promo producers in Jacksonville. And we had a lot of other people that went on to good careers. So I'm proud of them, my kids, as I call them. And then after being in Jacksonville about 2.5 years, it was now the spring of 1978. And my boss, Joel Chaseman, said, we need you in Miami, which was terrific because Miami was a bigger market. It was an ABC station, and deep down inside, I'm an ABC guy from my Cap Cities days and my West Virginia days. And even when I was a group program director, I loved ABC. And so I got to run an ABC station in Miami, and it was probably the best 6 years of my life, till I got to the Academy. I really enjoyed that. I walked into that station, and that station was number 3 in news. We hadn't turned it around. The programming, the GM there didn't want to listen to anything I suggested, and eventually he wasn't there anymore, and I took over. And
What were you originally hired as?
General manager. What do you mean?
Okay, because you said the GM there didn't want to listen to you.
He didn't, when I was the head of programming.
Oh, okay.
When I was the head of programming. And so he eventually moved on, and I went into Miami. Loved the job, loved the city, loved everything about it. Now I had a wife and 2 kids, and the kids were now 9 and 6.5 or 7. And about this time, I thought to myself, I can't move them anymore. They've been moving a lot every 2 years or 3 years as kids, and they probably don't remember half of it, but by the time you're 10, you should probably try to stay put. So I decided I want to stay in Miami for as long as they were in school. It was a great gig, just a great gig. We were able to take a station that had a lot of the right parts, it just wasn't strong enough yet, and turn it into a number 1 station. I brought with me the One and Only campaign, but we didn't put it on the air until we had a newscast we thought was worthy of it. I always believed in a word that I heard years ago from some researcher. It was called anticipappointment. Anticipappointment meant if you plug yourself for anything you do as wonderful, and then people come and take a look and don't agree, they're gone for a long, long time. So you don't promote it as being wonderful until it's wonderful. And that's where the word anticipantment comes in. You don't want to anticipate something and then be disappointed. So we didn't put the One and Only campaign on for almost a year. My news director and I, a bright fellow, that I inherited, by the way, and he was very good, Dow Smith, we would look at the news every day. We'd make it a little better. My term was I want a rock and roll newscast, left over from the Buffalo days. I want it tight. I don't want any dead air. I want it to move lickety-split. We're going to be the newscast in town that is all about promotion and production because the news is the news. But if you can package it in a way that people think it's exciting, then you might have something special. And that's what we did. I used the 3 Ps, promotion, production, and personalities. And every station has their own personality, but you got to promote them right. And now you call it marketing, then it was called promotion. We had a woman on as the main anchor named Ann Bishop, who had been on the air a few years and was just great. She had this strong, strong voice, which, of course, I mentioned how much I cared about voices. We were up against a CBS station in town that had a man who'd been on the air since 1952 with an incredible stentorian voice. And he had been number 1, but this is now 1978, 79. It's getting to be a little older in his audience. And then we did things that used to make my competition nuts. I would go out with a sales piece that said, the only people under 50 watching their station are the nurses behind the wheelchairs. And I got a call from the boss who said, how can you do this? I said, disprove me. We called it the nut level, nurses using television. And I once bought a bus bench card right outside the guy's window, promoting my station, just to drive him nuts. I was always having fun. To me, it was fun. It might have been competitive, but it was always fun. We eventually increased our news to an hour in the early evening, and then an hour and a half in the early evening. The CBS station was still number 1 in the early evening, but they only did a half hour, so we ran promotion talking about the fact that more people watch our news in the early evening than his, because you cume our audience, and it was bigger than his audience. But in real averages, he was number 1. He called again screaming, and I just loved it every time I got under his skin. It was wonderful. Between the bus bench and the cume audience and all the other things, I was having a competitive fun day. And Steve Croft from Jacksonville came with me, and that was pretty great because before he went off to CBS News, he did some of the most fantastic stories. I remember the story that got Steve to CBS was he did a series on all the shootouts and cocaine cowboy problems in Miami. Remember, this is the late 70s, early 80s. This was the number 1 city in America for 3 years running in supplying news to the network. More than New York, more than Washington, Miami was it. It was a lawless, crazy town. We had the Colombian drug gangs fighting the Cuban drug gangs. We had the Mariel boat lift. We had riots in Overtown. We had riots in Liberty City. 25,000 criminals were dumped on the city when the Mariel boat lift from Cuba happened. One of the guys who worked for me went down to get his mother in Cuba, and he was forced by gunpoint to take 4 prisoners back with him if he was going to take his mother back. And that's how all these prisoners came to the shores of the United States. So it was a lawless town. It was really a semi-lawless town in the early 80s with lots and lots of money floating around because of cocaine. And it was great for newscasts. It was great every day, something else. Well, anyway, Steve Croft did a series on the cocaine cowboy shootouts. And the series was titled Just Another Day in Dodge City. And the title came to Steve while he was standing in front of a shootout in Fort Lauderdale where 14 people were killed. And a cop from the Fort Lauderdale Police Department said to Steve, you know, it's just another day at Dodge City. So Steve decided, I'm going to use that as the title. And that series was so good that someone at CBS saw him and hired him for the network, where he's gone on to fame with 60 Minutes. Good reporter, good reporter. I also remember another Steve Croft story. 1979, Steve did a story in the spring about what if hurricane number 4 this year, named David, was to hit Miami and Miami Beach on Labor Day. Will we be prepared? Can people get off the beach? Can we survive a big hurricane? And he ran the story in the spring trying to get everybody ready for a hurricane just in case. So Labor Day weekend comes around. Hurricane number 4, David, is bearing down on Miami. Steve is going a little nuts because he did a story on this weekend, on this hurricane, and it came to fruition. So at the last minute, the hurricane took a sharp north turn and went towards Palm Beach instead of Miami. And Steve gets in a car with a photographer. Remember, there's no cell phones back then. And starts chasing the hurricane up the state because it's my hurricane. And I remember I was in the newsroom. We got a call from a phone booth somewhere between Miami and West Palm Beach. And you hear the wind, and you hear Steve say, "We have a quarter tank of gas. How far can we get on this? All the gas stations are closed." And he was chasing the hurricane as far as he could go. That's dedication. That's a great reporter. And we had some other great reporters at that station that have gone on to the network. Steve was replaced by a guy named Wyatt Andrews, who went on to be a correspondent for CBS News out of Washington. We had Richard Schlesinger, who does reports on CBS Sunday Morning. Susan Candiotti, who worked at CNN. I'm going to forget some people. We had some incredible people there. Garrett Glazer. I can't even remember all the great reporters, but about a dozen of them went on to network jobs, and Miami was now looked at as a place to find reporters directly to the network. You didn't have to go to New York. You didn't have to go to L.A. Go to Miami. And generally our station, because we were the rock and roll television newscast station. We did promos for the station that when we finally thought one night we were watching the 6 o'clock news and we said, "That's perfect. Now we can unleash the one and only." And we did. And it had a song to it, and people started singing it. And the one and only TV10 was in everybody's mind for years. I remember about 20 years later, I'm at a class at USC on marketing, and we're talking about different things, and I asked anybody from South Florida here. And 2 19-year-old girls raise their hand and say, "We're from Fort Lauderdale." And I said, "Do you have any TV station in your area that goes by a name different than its call letters or channel number?" "Oh, yes, the one and only." And I was very proud until I asked the wrong question. "How long has that been on the air?" Which was followed by, "All our lives." So stop when you're ahead. Anyway, that stayed on the air in that city about 25 years, and then one of the new managers decided to get rid of it. So the only station that I helped put it on the air at is still Jacksonville, which has it running after 35 years. But it's a great campaign. Miami was a great town for news. Our news became number one. We expanded our news to 90 minutes early, the only station in town to do that. We put the first Cuban-American anchor on the air in Miami, a female, which didn't have any problems like the African-American in Jacksonville. That was a good thing to do. I had the first all-female news team at noon. Actually, our news team at noon included female anchors, a female producer, and a female director, and we were really happy about that. It's the first time anybody had done that. We did a show. I helped invent a show in Miami called Florida. I called up 7 cities in Florida, ABC stations first, and asked if they would like to have an hour every 3 months for free, a show focusing on what's going on in Florida that they could run in prime time. Their only cost would be a 6-minute piece to go into the show. I figured 6 times 7 stations is 42 minutes. You put your own narrator on locally, and you have an hour special in prime time. And we did it sort of light subjects, the craziest hobbies in the state and things like that. Somebody with a ball of twine, I don't know. But it got big ratings. We did it every 3 months. We preempted the network, of course, because you could do that if you weren't an O&O. And we got to sell a primetime hour with all the spots for the cost of a 6-minute piece done once every 3 months by your news department. That was kind of a PM magazine idea. I just used it for the state of Florida because there were 7 major cities. I remember the only city that we couldn't get a station in, a commercial station, was Tallahassee, so we got the public station, I don't know how they filled out the other 15 minutes, but that was not our problem. But everybody did the piece, and it ran for 7 years, long after I was gone. I was very proud of that one. I remember I tried a game show on a Saturday night. Our station had gotten so strong, and it was huge with the 18 and 49s, but we had none of the 50-pluses. I mean, we were really the young station in town. So we decided we wanted to do a show that would get us older people. So we put on a show. It was the newlywed game for people who had been married 35 years or longer. And I got Bert Parks, if anybody remembers that name, who was living down there, to be the host. And I forgot the name of it. It was something like Senior something or other. And we sold the Polydents and the Cadillacs and all the commercials we couldn't get for the young audience in that show. And it lasted a while. It was produced by Nicholson and Muir, the two guys who originally invented the newlywed game and sold it to Chuck Perris. And they did a show called Pay Cards, and the Roger Muir of Nicholson and Muir was the first program director at WNBC in New York in 1948. And Nick Nicholson was the second Clarabelle the Clown on Howdy Doody. And they were producing partners. So I got to meet some really great people, including Bert Parks. And we did that show for about a year. I remember when I was head of programming at the Washington Post, I suggested a 7 o'clock show for the station in Miami, Bowling for Dollars. And we put it on the air, and it went through the roof. We built a bowling alley in the prop room by the studio, and it ran for a few years, had big ratings. Speaking of programming in Miami, we were not doing well from 4 to 6 when I got there, and we only had enough money to buy 2 shows. That's difficult if you want to go 4 to 6 with, let's say, sitcoms. So we bought Happy Days and All in the Family. But when I bought All in the Family, I wanted to run it back-to-back 5 to 6. This is 1979. Back then, nobody was ever running a syndicated show back-to-back. You bought a show, and it played once a day. I talked to Viacom at the time. I want to run this back-to-back. And they said, you can't. Our contract reads you ready one a day. I said, well, how can I get this changed? He said, you have to call Norman Lear. So I called Norman Lear. And I said, Norman, there's 206 episodes of this. We wouldn't, even back-to-back, you wouldn't have a rerun for almost 21 weeks. I said, and I promise the 5 o'clock show will then play at 5:30. So the same audience may or may not be available at each time, but you have enough episodes. I'd like to play All in the Family 5 to 6. Then I also did that with Paramount for Happy Days. And we wound up playing Happy Days 4 to 5 and All in the Family 5 to 6, and we became a huge #1 leading into our 6 o'clock hour of news. A little later on, we moved the news back because we wanted to get money at 7 o'clock for a access show rather than run the network news. But those were the glory days. We kept making little changes, and it kept getting better and better, and it was more fun. And I brought with me a young man named Jim Paratori, who became my promotion director at the time, who was brilliant and a good right-hand person. I can't remember much. Oh, I remember we had a news producer named Sharon Buchanan, and I hired a fellow out of Denver named John Scott, and they were both married. Next thing you know, they were both divorced, and the next thing you know, they were married to each other. And Sharon Scott is now the president of Peacock Productions, the NBC production house that's doing this Flight to the Moon or whatever and other things. She's terrific. And John Scott has been the anchorman in the morning on Fox News for quite a while. Those are a couple of others of my kids. We had lots of kids. I can't remember. We had so many great executives, too. But I've always prided myself on hiring very smart people who loved TV as part of my interview process. I would ask questions like, what do you watch on TV? Which are your favorite commercials? What's your favorite movies? I wanted to know their pop culture quotient. The higher the pop culture quotient, the better they would be as an employee. You can check out the other stuff, how they manage and stuff, but the most important part to me was understanding the business like I did. And it was really great to sit around or stand around with some of the people you work with and be able to share television and movies and pop culture with them because we were all on the same page. Very important to me to hire people who understood that. And so the Miami years were wonderful. I was there from 78 to 84. The station went from last to first. We had some great people go through. I'm trying to remember now. We did the Don Shula show. I remember once getting an argument with the coach, Don Shula. It wasn't a happy day. We were running the Don Shula show at 8:30 Monday nights. And we always got the network to give us a pre-release of their 8 o'clock Monday night show at 7:30. So we'd play at 7:30 to 8:30, Don Shula, then Monday Night Football. And, I have a Monday Night Football story too. And one year the network wouldn't give us the show, pre-released. They didn't like that. It was, I think the show was 240 Robert, I think was the name of the show. And so we had to play an access show at 7:30, and we had to fill 8 to 8:30. And I put on a Bugs Bunny cartoon show, 8 to 8:30. Well, the phone rings. It's Coach Shula. You're leading into my show with cartoons? Yes, sir. I did this in Jacksonville on Saturday nights that went through the roof. Bugs Bunny cartoons in prime time are still good. I don't think so. You're ruining my show. And I remember saying, Coach, I don't tell you how to run your team. Don't tell me how to run my television station. We didn't talk to each other for a year. But when the ratings came in and the show did better than it ever did before, he kind of calmed down. And that's how we did that one year. And 240 Robert, it reminds me that the producer of 240 Robert, whose name escapes me right now, his parents lived in Fort Lauderdale. And this was his first big network show. And he wanted them to see the show. And it wasn't being shown in Miami. So I worked out where we would pick them up in a car and bring them to our conference room every Monday at 8 o'clock so they could see their son's show on the network feed. And I remember he was always very happy about that. The little things you do that you should. So where was I going? Paratori came with me. We had a great staff, great sales manager, great news director, good anchors. We had some stories that are very strange. When I got there, we had a male news anchor who eventually was replaced because he just was a Ted Baxter type. Terrific reader, not too much upstairs. And I won't mention his name, but I do remember this. We hired a woman to be in our PR department to go to the Fort Lauderdale Broward County Fair the first night she was on the job. She was going with our anchorman in a limo so he could sign autographs at the fair. So she gets in the limo and picks him up, and his girlfriend's coming along. And the limo driver's a pretty woman. And during the drive, the girlfriend, who is drunk, thinks he's making passes at the limo driver. So she pulls out a gun and says, "Don't do that anymore." And he, being the anchorman that he is, knocked her out, punched her and knocked her out. So Tuesday morning, the 22-year-old first day on the job PR lady comes in to resign. And I said, "What's the matter?" And she said, "Well, this is what happened last night." And I said, "Oh, that's just Glenn. Don't worry about it. It gets better." And I talked her into staying. But how's that for your first day on the job? Which also reminds me, we had a promotion producer working there named George Greenberg. Wonderful guy, very talented. And he came in one day and resigned because his father wanted him to go into the family business. And I remember sitting in my office with him for about an hour, telling him he's too talented to get out of television, that you gotta stay in television, you're too good. And I talked him into staying. Well, George Greenberg eventually came out here to work at ABC Sports, and he invented the start of Monday Night Football. Are you ready for some football? That was George. So he's the father of the opening of Monday Night Football on ABC, and in a way I must be the grandfather of the opening of Monday Night Football. George now runs a network for, I think, Fox out here. Very talented guy. But another, like the Brandon Tartikoff story, life takes its turns, and he could have gone off to work in his father's business, and maybe there never would have been, "Are you ready for some football?" It's just amazing how these little things occur. Anyway, it was a great staff in Miami, and I enjoyed it. Now, about 3.5 years into my job in Miami, I get a call from my boss, Joel Chaseman, who says, "We have a production company out in L.A. It's not doing well, and I'd like you to go out and run it." I said, "Well, my family's here, and I don't want to move, and I'm enjoying my job. And he says, do me this favor. You don't have to move your family. You can live in Miami and work in L.A. part-time and clean this up, either make it work or close it up. I said, okay. So I recommended a fella to replace me. His name was Walter Liss, who eventually went on to become the president of the ABC-owned stations after Larry Pollock retired. And Walter came in from Fresno to run the station. I had an office down the hall. And I would come to L.A. on a Sunday night and stay for almost 2 weeks and fly back on the week from Friday. And I'd be home 3 weekends out of 4 and 2 full weeks with my family. And I'd be out in L.A. for 9 business days. The interesting part is no one in L.A. knew that I was still living in Miami. It's when I met all the agents and producers and syndicators. And then the rest of it I do by phone or I think fax machine back then. No, 1982, I'm not sure we had email. No, we did not. And that was my first taste of L.A. and shows and programming. My first sad job was to fire Charlie Rose. He had a syndicated show for the company. It wasn't doing well. I had to go and visit him in Washington, show him the ratings, and tell him it's not going to be continued. Charlie and I are still friends to this day because at least I was upfront and honest with him. And I like to point out Charlie's 6 days older than I am. Anyway, so firing Charlie Rose was not pleasant, but I did start a young man's career at that point. We put a new show on the air while I was running this Post-Newsweek video. This 48 or 49-year-old talk show host from radio named Larry King, who had never had a national TV show. And I went to Larry and asked, would you like to do a national TV show for syndication? He said yes. I then had to go to his boss at Mutual Radio because Larry was doing midnight to 5 every night from Washington. And the boss, Marty Rubenstein, would not allow Larry to do Monday through Friday. He said, I do not want him doing a talk show and then having to work all night long. So we wound up putting Larry on once a week, Sunday nights at 11:30 from the Chamber of Commerce studios in Washington, D.C. He did very well. He had like a 3 rating. But a 3 rating for 90 minutes on a Sunday night couldn't support the show. So eventually, after a year, it went away. But it was the precursor of the CNN show. And it was a live show, took phone calls. It was the same show. And very proud of that. And even today when I see Larry, we laugh about it because we go to lunch once a year, and I lay out the same question every year, which is, Larry, let me get this straight now. In 1983, we paid you $400,000 a year, and you had 3 million viewers. So now you're on CNN, or you went to CNN, and you were paid $8 million a year, and you had 1 million viewers. How's that work out? And his answer is always the same. Ain't cable great? So.
What did you see in him?
He was one of the best interviews I ever heard. He didn't study; he listened. And so, as much as some people used to say he asked soft questions, no, he asked hard questions in a soft way. He was able to get at whatever you're thinking. What I always thought was great about Larry King is he asked the questions the audience was thinking to ask when they were watching. And he did it basically by listening to the guest. I thought he had a great talent, and he had been doing it 20 years on the radio. But now we put him on TV. So that was one of my shows for Post-Newsweek that didn't work, but got him going. We won some awards. We won some Ace Cable Awards. We did Working Mother Magazine, I remember that, which played on the Cable Health Network, which became Lifetime. And we won an Ace Award for that, and we did a couple of shows I can't remember. But for the most part, when I got here, we had 20-some people working in L.A. on movie scripts and stuff, and we got rid of them because we weren't in the movie business. We were in the first-run business. And eventually, we closed it up. But I had reduced the staff to 3, including me, and we were running efficiently. It's always terrible to let people go, but in this case, it was overstaffed in the first place. We did a movie. Basically, we were the financiers of the movie. We weren't the movie people. There was a producer named Merrill Karpf and a director who did all these Hallmark Hall of Fames named George Schaefer. And they had gotten the rights to a story called Right of Way. And they had Jimmy Stewart and Betty Davis as the stars of a made-for-TV movie for HBO. It was the second movie HBO ever did. The first movie they did was something about a runner in Canada, somebody Fox story. And the second movie they did was Right of Way with Betty Davis and Jimmy Stewart. I can't tell you the excitement my mother had when I sent her a copy of the signed contract with Jimmy Stewart's name and my name and Betty Davis's name and my name on the same page. That was, now she understood what I was doing. Anyway, the movie is out there somewhere. I don't know who owns the rights. I think the Washington Post does. But it's a movie that hasn't been seen in 30 years. And we thought it was their last movie. Both Jimmy and Betty were old. And we thought, well, this might be great because not only are they great as actors, but this might be their last movie. As it turns out, they each did more afterwards. But I got to meet Betty Davis and Jimmy Stewart and see some of the shooting. We shot at the studios where they did Gone with the Wind, down on Washington, I think. And that was fun. So I got a taste of production back then. I got to meet the agents. And then we closed it up. And sure enough, at that moment, Walter List went on to become president of Cox Broadcasting. And I went back to running the television station in Miami. And everything worked out fine. The kids weren't upset. For another year, I ran the TV station. Now we're up to 1984. I just completed 6 years, 4.5 to 5 running the TV station, and 1.5 running the production company. Had a great time. Wonderful man, Joel Chaseman, who I worked for 11 years. And then all of a sudden the phone rang, and a fellow named Tony Casera was on the phone, who at one point ran Channel 5 in L.A., KTLA, and he was now working for KKR, the leveraged buyout people. And KKR had already bought Gene Autry's station in L.A., and now they were going to buy the Storer television stations and the Wametco television stations. And Wametco owned the CBS station in Miami. And he said, I have an offer you can't refuse. So we talked. I flew out to L.A. He made me this gigantic offer, first in money and second in a little ownership in the TV station, to leave the ABC station and come over to the CBS station, which now had become number 2 because we had killed it at PLG. Very tough decision in the sense of I'd worked for this company 11 years. I was close to everybody from Kay Graham to Ben Bradley to Joel Chaseman and my staff. But how often do you get a chance to have a piece of a television station which eventually will be sold? So they gave me $1 million worth of stock in the TV station without me having to pay a penny for it. When we cash in, you pay the $1 million back. And I went over. And it was, the columns were wonderful about how wonderful I was, but the sadness of leaving my friends was tough. However, not all my friends were left behind. I thought Jim Paratori might make a great program director, too. So for the third time, I hired him, along with 2 other people from PLG, Lois Friedman, my research director, and Ed Parker, my business manager. And the 4 of us went over to WTVJ with lots of anger from the old station that I took some of the people. We were like aliens. We were the people who came in to run a TV station that we had knocked off its perch. Not good. Coupled with the fact that there were 300 employees at WTVJ, and I had 190 at WPLG. And my 190 did much more news than the 300 did over at TVJ. So one of the things I had to do was fire people. And I met in a studio with the entire staff, and I told them, 100 of you will be gone a year from now. This was a real tough day for me, too. Probably tougher for them, but it was a tough day. 100 of you will be gone a year from now. Just do your jobs the best you can, and we will try to assess how good you are at what you're doing. And if there's a different job that we could put you in, we're going to do that. And we took on the burden of trying to figure out which 200 out of the 300 were the best employees. It's kind of like Jack Welch at GE, who says you always lop off the bottom 10% every year, and you'll get a better group. I didn't know Jack Welch or anything at that point, But that's kind of what we were doing. We're going to try to lop off the bottom third, whoever they would be.
What did that do for morale?
Not good. Not good. But over the next 6 months, people realized that we weren't doing this arbitrarily. We didn't fire anybody for probably 3 or 4 months. And we were doing a show called PM Magazine over there that wasn't really making any money, so we decided we'd take it off the air. It had 22 employees, and we talked to them, and we moved 12 of those employees to the news department, got rid of 10 of them, and then we got rid of 12 employees in the news department. It was kind of what I said, you try to keep the strongest people. Very difficult year, because I don't like to fire anybody. We came up with some pretty good severance packages. The sales manager, who I also replaced, wound up becoming a close friend I played cards with, because he wound up setting up his own video business in weddings and bar mitzvahs and making more money than he made as a sales manager at the television station. But it was a difficult year, 84, 85. But the station became like a Cap City station, lean and mean. One of the Cap Cities things they taught me was, if you operate with the same amount of people during good times, you can operate with the same amount of people during bad times. You don't have to add in good times, and you don't have to subtract in bad times. Another good lesson that the network seems to have never learned, because every few years you see a network saying, we're dumping 10% of the staff because of cost cutting. Well, maybe you didn't need them in the first place. So I learned that firing people was a difficult thing. You had to treat people individually and treat them well, but you had to do what's right for the company. So anyway, we became leaner and meaner, and started doing our newscasts better. Then I decided it's time for me to meet with this stentorian-voiced anchorman who'd been there since 1952. And I bet you can't guess what I offered him. A job for life as the head of editorial, specials. He could go to Europe for VE Day and go to Japan for VJ Day, because he was much better as a voiceover guy now than a newsreader. And he thought about it a while, and he turned it down. Whereas the guy in Jacksonville, whose wife wrote me when he died that was the best day of his life, this guy in Miami decided he didn't want to do it. He eventually ran for governor of Florida and got creamed. But different people look at things different ways. Anyway, I remember in looking for his replacement.
So you fired him?
He resigned before I had to fire him. He knew what was coming, but he comes back from a vacation and says, I think I'm going to quit. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I couldn't be luckier. And he made the announcement. I've driven the bus for 26, 27 years. It's time to get off the bus. And he went on his own way. It was great. It helped me a lot. So I turned to my news director and I said, I came from a station that had a female anchor, middle-aged female anchor with a great deep voice, who was the station, is my opinion. And I've come to a station with an older male anchor with a great deep voice, and I want to find someone just like the guy we had, except 20 years younger, right? And I said to my news director, find me someone like John Hambrick in New York City. So he comes in the next day, he says, you're not going to believe this. I found you someone just like John Hambrick. I said, who? He said, John Hambrick. He got fired yesterday. So we called him up, and in a matter of a couple of days, we worked out a deal, and he moved to Miami to be the anchorman at the CBS station, which was really terrific. We got a younger, good-looking, great-voiced anchorman who was a wonderful human being. He's one of the few anchors that sat there between 8 and 10 and wrote his own newscast. I mean, you don't get those often anymore. You get a lot of newsreaders. He was an old-fashioned reporter anchorman. And he was a wonderful guy, and the staff loved him. And he passed away earlier this year, a great human being. And he was there until I left. He was still on the air. And he made the station stronger. At 11 o'clock, though, we put the original Cuban-American woman that I put on the air at WPLG, we then put on the air at WTVJ. and the newscast ratings were good. And we were working under some tough rules. We didn't have any money to spend. We never spent any money in those 4 years I was there on any capital expense. We had a chance to buy Oprah when she came out in 1985. I went to my boss, Tony, and I said, this lady is beating Phil Donahue in Chicago. I think we should buy this show. And we can buy it for the morning. And if it works, we can move it to the afternoon. And he said, what do you have running in the morning now? And I said, reruns of Big Valley. He said, how much does the Big Valley reruns cost you? I said, $0. All paid for. He said, how much would Oprah cost you? And I don't remember the number, $5,000 a week or something. He says, you can't buy Oprah. I said, why? He says, because when we sell the station, we sell it for 10 or 12 times earnings. And if you're going to add another $50,000 or $100,000 to the expense line, then you're going to be costing us $1 million in the sale price or more. You can't buy it. Ouch! Now, welcome to Leverage Buyout City. So my old station bought Oprah and stayed on the air for 25, 30 years, sadly. But at least I knew it would work. Sadly, I couldn't get it. So we were working under somewhat of a handicap. We couldn't get all the shows we wanted, but the station still did well. We still did well. And the late news finally got back into a tie with WPLG at 11 o'clock. So that was it's harder to come from first to second and go back to first than it is from third to first. I can tell you that because I've lived them both. So in 1988, well, here comes the soap opera part of the show. In 1987, we went to sell the television station. If we sold it for $270 million, we all broke even. Anything over $270 million, we all make money. Anything under $270 million, we owe money to KKR. We sold the station for $410 million to Lorimar. Okay? Then Larry Tisch, the president of CBS, gets involved. Larry Tisch says, I'm going to pull the CBS affiliation from you if you sell it to Lorimar. He said, Lorimar's supplying us with Dallas and Knots Landing and many other shows, and I don't want a supplier to also be a distributor, because in the deal was also the Storer stations, and they were all CBS stations. And CBS didn't want Cleveland and Atlanta and Miami and some other stations controlling whether we clear other shows. And so Larry Tisch came in and said, any of you who get sold to Lorimar, I'm going to make you an independent. And there our $410 million flew away. And Larry Tisch then came in and offered us $170 million for our station, which isn't good when you have $1 million in stock and you're not going to make it back. So the only thing facing us at that point, there were some highs and lows back then, was we could sell, where could we sell a station in 1987 that wouldn't worry about losing CBS or the affiliation? Only two buyers in America, NBC and ABC. That was it. Fox was just getting started. Nobody knew how it would work. And we eventually sold it to NBC for $270 million. So after all that, we all broke even. And then we had to wait for the FCC to approve it in another year. It was a very interesting year for me because I remember the calls coming around about the Olympics in 1988. And they asked everybody on the conference call from New York to LA to Miami, how's your sales going for the Olympics? And everybody says how it's going, and then I chirp in, well, I'm a CBS affiliate right now. Sales aren't going too well for the Olympics. Oh, yeah, we forgot about you. What happened is NBC bought our station just after they renewed the NBC station in Miami for 2 more years. So we were CBS, and CBS wasn't going anywhere because they didn't want to go to the independent now. They'd rather go to the NBC station later. So I was an NBC-owned station running the CBS network. And in my Maverick-type way of doing things, I prepared a T-shirt that had the peacock with the CBS eye in the head. Both of them went nuts. You can't do that. And I said, I'm the only one who can do that. And so I still have one left. We gave everybody T-shirts that had a CBS eye and the peacock.
That's great. Is that the only time that's ever happened?
I believe it's the only time that ever happened. Yes. And let me go back a little bit. I forgot. One show I did at WTVJ, the CBS station, was Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. Because, again, I wasn't an O&O. They were running some show that was doing so-so. And I realized it was wrestling crazy time back in the middle 80s. So we put wrestling on from 8 to 9 on Wednesday evenings. And it went through the roof. It was the number 1 or 2 show in town. And I'd get calls from the CBS affiliate people all the time. You can't do that. To which I'd answer my usual, I can do that. And we had a great time running wrestling and having a good time. Oh, let me go way back. One of the shows I did direct at the independent station in Cleveland was wrestling. And all the different things I did. On Sunday afternoons, we do 2 hours of wrestling. And the promoter was a guy named Kaplan from Akron, Ohio. But when he wrestled, he had a beard, and he was known as the Sheik. And he would look at the camera and babble. And the announcer would say, he's speaking in his own tongue. And he'd go out and kill somebody. And then he'd come in the control room and tell us when to end the matches. But the story I wanted to bring up about that wrestling show was there was a guy who set up the ring every week. And he wanted to be a wrestler. And Kaplan, the Sheik, said, well, you got to come up with a gimmick. So the guy came up with a gimmick, and the Sheik put him on TV. The gimmick was he had a baby pig as his manager. He'd walk into the ring with the pig under his arm, tie him up to the turnbuckle, and go out and wrestle. And then he'd be getting killed. And he'd crawl over to the pig, who would oink some directions in his ear, and he'd go back out and he'd win. This was hysterical. And the guy and the pig became a phenomenon for like a month. It was just great. What's the pig going to tell him this week? Anyway, after about 4 or 5 weeks, Kaplan said to the guy, what else you got? And the guy said, well, I don't have anything else. And a couple weeks later, he was setting up the ring and putting down the ring again. I always remember that because of what you can't make this stuff up. Anyway, that was a show I directed there. But that's reminded me of why we did wrestling in Miami years later.
Did you still have that kind of gimmickry going on? Did you still have that gimmickry going on later on in your WTVJ?
Well, we always wanted to have fun. We always did stuff for fun. You know, it was the days when you weren't an O&O, where you just didn't do news, you did other programs. I remember in Buffalo, I did a show on Sunday mornings called Sunday Surprise. The anchorman was on it, but it was kind of a Sunday morning show with all light features. And it showed our anchorman, who was very strong as an anchorman, another side of him, which was comedy and fun. And we had everybody doing everything. We had our public affairs director hosting Dialing for Dollars. We had our kid show host doing weather. I learned early on in Buffalo that you don't have to put people in slots and leave them there forever. People will accept people on the air doing more than one thing. And we did that in a bunch of places I was at. And I don't recall all the different crazy things we did, but from the Jacksonville old TV shows to the wrestling shows to the Florida, we just did lots of fun stuff. And that was the part that I enjoyed most of all about running television station. You had the day-to-day grind of newscasts and whether you're going to get sued, and we had great investigative reporters. We had one reporter in Miami named Clarence Jones who showed the connection between the docks of Miami and the New Jersey Mafia. Well, you should know that nobody drove in his car for a half a year. And he would actually, showed me once that when he'd come to work, he would pull a hair out of his head and lick it and stick it on his hood and to see if the hood was ever opened when he came back out. Little stuff like that. Because this is a city where an anchorman on the Univision station in the late 70s had his legs blown off when he got in his car. It was Dodge City. It was. Great for news, tough for living. My kids grew up in it and seemed to come out okay. They both live in Fort Lauderdale now. But it was a rough town. Our house was broken into. My car was stolen. Just run-of-the-mill stuff that goes on in Miami during the crazy early 80s. It was nuts in the early 80s. It calmed down a little towards the late 80s. So anyway, the TVJ story was we finally sold it to NBC for no money. And then I was still young enough to have that gutsiness about me, where I flew to New York with my business manager, had a meeting with KKR and said, we're going to break even now. We've been rich and we've been poor, and now we're breaking even. But it's going to take the better part of a year for the deal to go through with the FCC. So if you want us to stay around, we need a big bonus. We're not making money any other way. And I was kind of shaking in my boots when I said this. Here I am threatening Henry Kravis and KKR that if you don't pay us, we're leaving. And all they said was, thank you, we'll get back to you. And we walked out of there shaking. And about a week later, they called us up and offered us huge bonuses for all the people that I brought with me who owned littler pieces than me. And that kept us there, except for Paratori, who Lorimar loved so much, they offered him a job out here at Telepictures. So that's how they met him, and that's how he got to L.A. before me. So in the spring of '88, summer of '88, the deal went through, and we became an NBC O&O, at which time I got a visit from Bob Wright and a few other people saying, we love you, you have a good reputation, goodbye. We want to bring in our own people. So they paid me off for the year, and I went away.
Did you expect that?
I kind of did. Because they have lots of stations, and I was an outsider. And so then that's part one of my career.
Well, actually, before we move on, at WTVJ, you also are credited with hiring Katie Couric.
Oh yes, forget these little things. 1984, we're looking for a female reporter, and we get this tape from a producer from CNN, who was able to sit on the set and do some anchoring, not on the air, just for the tape. And we liked her, and we brought her in, and we found out that she was just full of energy. I'm not going to use the word perky. She hates the word perky. But she was full of energy and fun and laughable and smart. And she was already like 26 years old and couldn't get on the air anywhere. So we hired her as an on-air reporter, and she was great. She was a really good reporter, but even better than that, she was just a great personality. And I remember I did say this once to her when she wanted to anchor the 7:25 cut-in, and I said, I don't think you're an anchor, Katie. You're a personality. Showing you that even I can make a mistake. Who knew she'd become a Walter Cronkite? Anyway.
Was she good right from the start?
From the start. She really is smart, and just she was the love of my life in the sense of just fun and smart and good. When you get people like that, they elevate the whole newsroom. I eventually assigned her to Fort Lauderdale, where she met my Fort Lauderdale News Bureau chief, a woman named Lisa Gregorich, who is the senior head of the show Extra, and a few other shows over at Telepicture. Lisa and Katie became good friends because Katie was working for Lisa in Fort Lauderdale. Lisa was a reporter on the street when I got there, and again, shifting everybody around. I decided Lisa was more of an executive type than a reporter, and she proved me correct over all these years. So they became good friends. I think Katie actually was engaged for a while to the head of PR for the Fort Lauderdale Police Department, but then that went away. And then eventually she moved on to Washington and her career. But between Steve Croft and Katie and all the other people that came through, we had a great group of good reporters at both stations. And my 10 years plus in Miami was just wonderful. Much better in the first station when I had money and we could go from third to first than at the second station when I had no money, and for a while I was actually bankrupt on paper. This was not a good feeling. When they lost $100 million, I would have lost about $600,000 or $700,000 or $800,000. And guess who didn't have $600,000 or $700,000 or $800,000? Moi. So getting out even with a little bonus was great once you're at the bottom looking up. Anyway, so then that's the end of 1988 and the end of job section number 1, my local station years. One more thing on my local station years. I was the president of NATIS, the ME people out of New York, because I was running a local station, and I was president of the Suncoast chapter, which at that time included Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, I think Georgia, I'm not sure, but it was a regional chapter. And years later, they gave me a special award, a Silver Circle something award, I forgot what it was called now, for the great work I did in Miami. I actually was awarded an Emmy when I was in Miami for uplifting Miami television, which was a lot more stodgy and slow when I got there and a lot more crazy when I left. And the Fox station, when we sold to NBC, the CBS affiliate went to the Independent, and Fox went to the old NBC station. So all stations in the market changed except for the ABC station. It made it quite crazy for a while for everybody. And I was given an award for bringing Miami television along to really be quick. And then the Fox station hired a fellow named Joel Cheatwood, who even took it to a different level of fast pace. And if you go to Miami now, you will see a news on every station that's certainly faster paced than anything you'll ever see in LA, still to this day.
And that's because of your contributions?
All of our contributions, yeah. But it goes all the way back to rock and roll newscasts. It really does. Production, promotion, personalities. And so that was a glorious part of my career, but after running 3 stations for 12 or 13 years, I decided I want to try something else. So that closed that chapter. Now we have chapter 2, work-wise. This is called production. In 1989, I was hired by Scripps Howard, a very good television station company. They did not have a production company, but they wanted to get into production. They knew me from my post-Newsweek production days, and they knew me through my stations and my programming, and they hired me to start them up in something called Scripps Howard Productions. The entire staff was me.
Where were you based at that time?
I was still based out of Miami. They were based out of Cincinnati. They allowed me to stay in Miami, but I went back to the old fly to LA, fly back to Miami. Fine, I got lots of mileage over those years. I took one of those rental offices in the Fox Plaza building, so people thought I actually had an office here when it was one of those, I don't know what you call those, but it's you rent it, but you're not in it. It's just there, place for your mail and you just show up to have meetings and things like that. I stayed next door. It then was the Marriott, so I got a lot of Marriott points, and I'd be here for 9 or 10 days a month, and then all the weekends back home in Miami. In the meantime, between 1984 and 1988, while I was at the station WTVJ in my personal life, I wound up getting divorced. My wife of 20 years and 21 years, and I got divorced. We had met, gotten engaged, and got married in 6 months, our senior year in college. Duh, we should be on some of those talk shows. The only difference was we were college-educated idiots instead of not. It lasted 20 years, which says a lot about our patience. But we really weren't right for each other after 8 or 10. But we raised our kids, and we had a nice life, and I got to thank her for moving with me so many times, even with the kids being young. And we still have a decent relationship, and it was nice, but don't get married in 6 months when you don't know the people. Neither of us knew each other too well. Anyway, so I got divorced in the middle 80s, and now I'm under the gun at KKR, and we're trying to make the station work. And for the first time in my life, I'm single because I went out of college into marriage, and so I was having a good time. I permed my hair. I had hair back then. Drove a convertible. Was doing all the middle-aged stuff you do when you're like 43 or 44 or 45 and running a TV station in a decent-sized market. Anyway, that was going on in the personal life.
Let's stop there to change the tape.